Hello, everyone. I am glad you are all with me. I have no idea who's on the other side, but I'm so excited that you are here. It is truly an honor to be able to be in the space with you. This is my very first time at the Polyglot gathering, as well as first time being a speaker here. So thank you. And yeah, I'm really glad to have all of you guys for what I think is going to be a really vulnerable conversation today, but super excited to get started. So I do want to give you a little bit more of my background before we officially begin. So, I am Emily, and I am the mind behind Language Travel Adoptee. And I think, of course, this is why we're all here, right? I think we all absolutely love learning languages, and I am no exception. But I think another thing that I want to make clear to all of us as we go into this talk is I don't believe that we talk enough about how our own humanity is linked to our language learning. And what do I mean by that? In other words, on we don't reflect enough on how our life stories are linked so much to that language learning process, beyond just what's on the surface, right? So beyond all the textbooks, beyond the exams, or even the lessons that we take, and also kind of beyond the reasons that you typically hear to learn a language. So I really believe all parts of who we are as people really deserve our attention and reflection to truly understand and I think ultimately benefit from the difficulties we all face in language learning. And if you haven't faced any difficulties, you definitely will because that's really how life goes. And that's how all of our language learning journeys at some point go. And of course, saying all of this, I think mental health plays a really big role in both our life and language story. You can't have one without the other. And I'm a very big advocate for mental health. And the I think part of how I advocate for mental health in general is by sharing my own experiences on difficult and also less discussed topics in language learning. So I think this type of reflection on just the tough life experiences we go through, it truly adds fulfillment to, I think, the toughest seasons in the process. And I'm guessing since we're all here, we do want languages to be a fulfilling long term part and passion of our lives. So I think you will really benefit from what we have to talk about today. But my main platform is YouTube. I am also the host for the Language Wellness and Identity podcast. And of course, I'll repeat everything at the end of the presentation. I don't want to spend too much more time on this, but please reach out, ask me questions. I'm happy to answer any and all questions in our Q&A session after the presentation. And even after the presentation, if you feel so inspired, I would love to hear from you just personally through any of my social media platforms, which I will put at the end of the presentation as well. But yeah, thank you for joining me. And without further hesitation, let's begin. So now I want to ask all of you a question, right? And that is, what is your language story? So I'll go first as you're thinking about your answer to that question. So my name is Emily, and I spoke English only until I taught myself German at 18. I learned Italian and Spanish. And then I began learning Turkish and Arabic after studying abroad in Germany and kind of having a lot of encounters with that part of the population that was living there. And I learned I had to shift around my learning methods and that I could prove to myself what I never thought I was capable of doing in the first place. But languages have totally opened up my world to new possibilities. That would be how I would tell my language learning story anywhere from 2 to 8 years ago, both to others and more importantly to myself. So now I want you to think about what might you have left out. And as I go more into my own reflection story about what I definitely left out, I think the importance of answering that second question for yourself will make a lot more sense just as we go. But while I have you thinking about your own answers, let me give you an example of how I would answer that initial question with my own story today. So, what you're seeing right now is a woman becoming a mother in a pretty unconventional way. This is actually the hallway of a hotel instead of a hospital. And that is me as a baby, decked out in all of my orange clothes. I'm sleeping and I'm being passed over. And here I'm also becoming part of a family that didn't look like me at all. And I can't remember this, of course. I think a lot of us can't really remember so far back when we were so young, but I think the body always remembers. And I now define my language learning story not starting at 18, like I said originally, but rather starting from the moment this picture was taken. And I spoke, according to my mom, only a few Chinese words here, and that's it. So I was actually one of the many babies, mostly girls, who were given up for adoption in the 1990s because of the one child policy. And approximately 85,000 of all of those baby girls were adopted from Americans. And we were left in various locations. I've heard from other adoptees, they might have been left at police stations, or they were left under city benches, or on a really busy street. And heartbreakingly enough, some even were left near dumpsters. And of course, there were already really big preferences given to boys at the time, just wanting boys over girls. And the child policy definitely didn't help with this. It greatly, greatly aggravated it as well. And this picture especially is of the group that actually went to China the same time that my mom did. So they were all single women, middle aged, I would say probably in their 40s or late 30s. And they were all there at the same time to officially adopt their children and hold them for the first time back in 1998. So when this picture was taken, I was 16 months old. And for me, it's really hard to imagine how my life actually was before I turned 16 months old. All I can really collect from that time before that are four things. So, the orphanage, and all the information that the orphanage told my mom when she adopted me officially, my nuanced emotions around what it means to belong and what it means to have an identity, my one birth note that was left with me, and the fourth thing is just general knowledge surrounding the political climate of China and the one child policy around when I was born. So I stayed with my birth parents for about 3 months after being born in southern China, and they left me on the steps of a Buddhist temple near Fujin. And that's where the monks took care of me until I was about 9 months old. And then I was transitioned to an orphanage in Guangzhou where I stayed for another about 7 months until my mom adopted me and officially brought me to the US and brought me to this family that you see here. Now, obviously, it's not going to take you a long time to figure out which one I am. But as you can see, I was raised in an exclusively white family, and it took me decades to really investigate how my perspective of myself, as well as my perspective of the world, and more importantly, how I saw myself to fit into the rest of the world. All of that was greatly, greatly influenced because of my adoption. And growing up only seeing my white family, who didn't give me at all a representation of what I really looked like, was also very influential. And this was not only reflected in my family, this was reflected in my friend group and cartoons I watched, just all of the content that I consumed, especially at the time when media wasn't so diversely represented with different looking people as it is now, unfortunately. But the fact is, no one really made me feel different, like I was a different race from them. And no one made me feel like I wasn't white in a sense. So saying this, right, I think on one hand, I feel lucky because I'm so grateful that I wasn't thrown with microaggressions and different discrimination from a really early age when I was still establishing the person that I was. And because also I know a lot of adoptees who have faced this at really young ages, unfortunately, especially if they're biracial or they live in a transracial family where they just look very different from where their family comes from, like me. So, on one hand, it was like that, but I think on the other hand, the fact that I almost exclusively only saw white faces and was not really made to feel any different from who I saw, that made me subconsciously want to be white and even fooling myself into thinking I was white. And I think whenever a Chinese international student showed up every now and then at school, I mean, first of all, I asked myself, why did they even pick Arkansas as the place to visit in the United States? Very, very small state in the South where I grew up. But I would also just not want to be associated with them at all. I would not want to approach them. I would not want to talk to them. And I felt completely alienated because they reminded me of what I actually looked like, that I looked like them and not my white peers that I so desperately wanted to fit in with. And I didn't want to be in the same place also with people who probably um, with who I probably would have shared the same culture as or the same mannerisms as or even have dressed the same as had it not been for my adoption. And just growing up how I did, anytime I saw these students, it was a really, really big shock. And it still is to an extent. So, of course, I was not really prepared for how the world would view me and my ethnicity and my sense of belonging until I was in my 20s when I decided to study abroad in Europe. And I think my whole life, I didn't care to reflect on how my life story, especially on how my life story played such an essential part in my language learning, and really understanding that. I don't think I was ever ready to really process that. And I was scared to really look more inside myself for that. But in saying that, I also really never wanted to learn my heritage language, Chinese, but I felt like I was forced to confront this language I never wanted to learn in the first place, especially once I was abroad and independent and by myself. So, this is where my language learning story really, really picks up and entangles further into my life story. And as I mentioned before in my initial introduction, I started with German first, and then I learned Italian. And once I was there, the biggest culture shock, it wasn't how practical or direct the Germans were. It was not how laid back and relaxed the Italians seemed to be, even though those were culture shocks in and of itself. I think what I'm about to say was a culture shock as well as just a life shock because my sense of belonging was greatly challenged and greatly disbelieved. And as I mentioned before, I grew up in a white family that did not make me feel any different from them race-wise. But once others believed abroad that or did not believe that I was American when I was abroad, and they practically interrogated me on where I was really from compared to my white American friends who were automatically believed. I think that difference really made me realize that wouldn't be accepted for who I knew that I was. I always thought I was American, and I still do. And I always define myself completely through my cultural identity instead of my ethnic identity. But because of my adoption, of course, I think I have come to realize that no matter where I am in the world, there will always be a lot of people who will identify me just by my ethnic identity, even after I have told them multiple times the story behind the languages that I speak. And I've also just come to terms with the fact that it'll always be this way, probably during my lifetime in many parts of the world. And I think as humans, of course, our identities constantly evolve. And in my case, I had come to terms with the dissonance and the contrast that existed between the white community that I grew up in and who I felt completely accepted by compared to how the outside world perceived me as, and the fact that they didn't really care to know my story behind the ethnicity that they saw. And I also found myself very unable to relate to my American friends who came from traditional American families. And it was just tiring to convince people that I was just as American as my American friends. And even those who were curious and had no intent to invalidate me, I think I felt like I had to still defend my existence, even to them, because, every time, because I just didn't match their definition of what it means to belong. And this happened to me almost every day. So to this day, I have never had an identity crisis. I was never caught in between in the sense that I never felt too white to be Asian or too Asian to be white. Again, I was never made to feel completely different from my white peers until I was abroad. So technically, I guess I've always felt more of not Asian at all, but being okay with that because it meant I could better relate to my white peers, if that makes sense. So I think in Europe, not all people, but many people told me that I even had a duty, an obligation to go back to my roots and learn Chinese. And especially after finding out that I had such a large passion for language learning, this was one of the most popular questions. Um, Even when I hadn't mentioned anything about Chinese or any other Asian language at all that I was learning at the time. But I think, of course, learning a language like that, it hits a much deeper nerve, as you can tell from my story. And Chinese isn't just another language that I feel I could learn at any point, not because I don't think I'm capable, but because of the very, very complicated story surrounding my background. And I think heritage languages are a curious thing in this way. They do represent an identity in a way for many language learners I've spoken to who are learning their heritage languages. And I think their stories are beautiful. But most likely, those learners were not impacted by a political policy that tore families and cultures apart. So the language in itself represents a lot of trauma for me and a lot of shame as well. And both of these feelings I felt were even more magnified uh, than they are now because I just had not processed them at the time, especially when I was abroad. So it was one of the worst feelings for me to meet someone who felt like they knew me better than I knew myself and just telling me how I must live life according to what they perceived to be true, solely based on my ethnicity, instead of just letting me process my own story and my own adoption on my own terms. And also just telling a stranger I was adopted during the very first conversation upon meeting them. I just wasn't comfortable at all with sharing something like that, sharing something so personable. And I either stopped the conversation or, you know, risked them getting frustrated with me because I wouldn't tell any other personal information like that. And as I had said before, I had zero interest in learning Chinese, but I also had zero interest in any other Asian language in the whole world. Literally my whole life. I pushed myself away entirely from anything that could risk giving me and I guess giving myself as an individual just a connotation with any part of myself being Asian, just because my cultural identity was so strong. And I think I had never met someone so insistent, though, that I go back and learn another Asian language as when I went abroad. And when I get all of these invalidating comments of my own experience and my own wishes, of course, that would deter anyone, I think, from wanting to learn a heritage language even further. But I think over these past few years, especially during the pandemic, it has been through my own processing of my life story and how that involves my language story and even transforms it in a way that has led me to actually reclaim a new curiosity about my past and how I can use what I already know how to do, which is the language learning part, in order to process and come to terms with something totally out of my control, which was the adoption part. And even though I say I still identify myself as 100% American, I feel at this point in my life, I am more open to my own definition of identity changing, even based on how learning my heritage language Chinese goes. And this feeling is refreshing and it makes me want to share more of my background with others. So, in this way, language learning, or rather the resistance to learning my heritage language Chinese, it definitely defines how my life story went up to this point. And Chinese is officially the ninth language that I will be learning. I think it will help me to connect my language learning even further to my own self discovery of who I am. So, if that means I feel less American and more Chinese, or still 100% American and not so Chinese at all during the learning process, so be it. And I think it's also a way for me overall to process just what I lost and processing even a place where I know I don't belong, but other people think I do anyways, and a place where I would have belonged had it not been for my adoption. And learning Chinese for me in this way it has its own healing too, right? Because I'm finally able to use a tool or even have a tool to process more what makes me different from the traditional family. And moreover, what makes me different from the traditional idea of what it means to belong. So, all that being said, though, I know that my language learning journey does need a lot more explanation than probably what you would expect when asking about someone who came to speak the languages that they do. And language learning at this point, it goes a lot more different for me than just wanting to know a different culture or wanting to travel someplace, wanting to get to work abroad. Not that those are not valid reasons. They are great reasons, and they're reasons that I learned some of the languages in the past that have really brought me to where I am today. But I do want to bring awareness to the less common reasons one could learn a language and to the range of human experiences and emotions that could accompany a language learning journey. And I think also just raise awareness to the fact that not all the opportunities and doors that language learning opens up for us are entirely positive, no matter how much they've made us grow. And in saying that though, I am grateful that I finally feel like I have processed enough to use language as a coping mechanism for me at the stage in my life, ultimately as an opportunity to empower myself, but on my terms this time. So I'm going to ask you again, what have you left out in your language story that still needs your attention? And if you feel like you didn't leave anything out, listen to that too and ask yourself, what does that tell you about your own story? And I think it's important to ask ourselves these questions and dig deeper because it really gives you a pathway to confront yourself and the experiences and achievements that you value and what your strengths are, even what you excel at, how you want to define yourself and continue showing up in the world. And why not investigate these questions through something that we are so passionate about, like language learning? And if you feel like going one step further and you are comfortable, I do want to empower you to begin sharing your own story, AKA your answer to this slide right now, because it is truly through this kind of authentic sharing that others will learn to connect with you and really allow them to discover something in common with you. And I think discovering a common humanity is so healing for all of us. It really also helps us to educate ourselves about others' experiences, even if even if we haven't lived those experiences ourselves. I think that is the key to true diversity. And secondly, I think reflection and acceptance of my own story has really helped me grow the resilience I need to keep me learning languages with joy and accept learning challenges in the process, especially during when we have challenges. And your definition of what is challenging for you is going to look different than maybe what's challenging for me. Looks different to a lot of different people. And I definitely, for example, in my case, I definitely didn't see anything in language learning resources about what prejudice I would face as I started my language journey. And I definitely didn't see anything about being adopted, nor anything about how cultural definitions of belonging in other countries would definitely clash with my own truth and with my own authenticity. And that was one of the biggest, or some of the biggest language learning challenges that I've had to overcome. And maybe your story does not involve adoption. Maybe it involves uncomfortable emotions of somehow feeling defeated or feeling like an imposter, fearful, overwhelmed, maybe even feeling like you aren't productive enough in your studies. My goodness, I've been there with all of those things. But I want to remind us all here today, we're all human beings behind the languages we speak, and you have so much more to offer the world than just your proficiency level. Just, the number of languages that you speak and how hard or productive you have studied, all parts of the language learning experience, both positive and negative, contribute to who you are. And I think your truth behind your story, right, is valid no matter if it is similar or very different from mine, but it deserves to be heard. But I think overall, before you even share it, I think your story deserves to be heard and acknowledged by yourself, first and foremost. So, now, if you have felt inspired by our talk so far, I want to remind you that I do have something really special for you that I want to give out that I made with you in mind. I think throughout my journey, I have mentioned again and again the resilience I have worked on that I think one definitely needs resources to maintain our mental health in this way, especially when there are difficulties. We need this just as much as we need actual language learning resources that teach you, how to write, read, and speak. So I do want to give you access to my free cheat sheet, and the website link under my bio, just for the Polyglot Gathering, will lead you to sign up to that link. But I made this with you and others in mind who have ever struggled with perfection and just generally negative thoughts in language learning, because as I started to process more the connection between my language learning and life story, I saw just how much more resilient I had become and how I became less nervous to face difficulty, just knowing successfully that I could come out on the other side. And this mental work that I share with you on the sheet has really helped me to continue learning 9 languages plus for all of these years, despite the challenges I mentioned in the presentation. So if you are feeling down at all, especially for any reason on your language learning journey, or if you feel like you might need a pick me up really quickly, or feel like you might need something like this in the future, I highly recommend you go get it. You can also find the link if you do search under my Linktree link that you'll find right there, and it'll be the first link listed. I also am on YouTube as my main platform. I think, as I mentioned before, there I definitely update you on how my Chinese language journey is going. I think I have 3 videos up so far that kind of detail where my mindset is as I go through even the first few lessons of uh, learning Chinese. I think right now I'm learning Chinese with Mango Languages, and I plan to be learning this language long term. And I'm excited to really share my really honest reflections with you, as well as just my general language learning progress and encouragement to accompany you along your language journey. So I do post there weekly, and you will also see I do host the Language Wellness and Identity podcast. And this podcast offers a much closer look. It delves a lot deeper into a lot of less discussed topics in the language learning community, like what you have seen here and beyond. So if you are curious, be sure to check that out and give a listen. A new podcast episode comes out every Wednesday morning in the US. And then, of course, you can also find me on Instagram, Facebook, as well as Twitter. But thank you guys so much for being here. It was really a really big step for me to talk so much about this in depth. But I am truly honored that I could make you a part of this journey as well. And of course, I am very interested in all of the questions you have for the last. I'm trying to think, when did we start this? It may have been around 3:10. So I think we have, looks like 15 minutes. I assume 15 minutes. All right. So question one from Astrid. Thank you for your question. What made you learn German as your first foreign language? So I learned German because I was brought very often with my mom, who was a professor to different universities as she taught. So she was a religions professor, and she of course, was taken around. I think we had gone to once to Hawaii. We had gone to China again when I was 10, stayed there for about a month while she taught a course at the university. And I think I just knew that I saw the world bigger than just the US, and I was really curious. And I saw my mom being an independent single woman, just out on her own in the world. And I think that really inspired me to go and do it for myself. So that's why I wanted to, in general, go abroad and kind of see how it was. And then I picked German because, and it's really ironic that I say this now, but I picked German because I knew that there were a lot of American expats and that Germans generally in my generation spoke really good English. So I generally thought that I would just learn the basics and not do anything else, and then I could just talk in English with them. So that was kind of my attitude. But it's funny to look back on that and see, oh my goodness, that is entirely the opposite of what I would probably say now, 8 years later. But thank you for your question. That was a really good one. Let's see. So Heather says, I sometimes feel guilt about being more interested in learning languages other than my heritage language. Does this feeling of guilt have any legitimacy? Any tips on managing it? So let me think about this. I think so. I think your guilt is, legitimate in the fact that it is valid what you feel. Heritage language learning, I don't think we talk about it a lot. And there are so many nuanced emotions that we can feel. And that really depends on what we have experienced in life so far. Um, I think I personally never experienced any guilt in not wanting to learn my heritage language or just being more interested in other languages, but other people tried to make me feel guilty, which pushed me away even more from it. Um, and I think, let me think. I think with that though, I think you really need to sit down and think about and even journal. I really like journaling to investigate these really deep questions with yourself because it's not just with these kinds of things, it's not just a one and done thing, right? You can't just sit and just kind of expect an answer. It takes a lot of reflection. I mean, it took me literally more than 8 years to get to the point where I am today. And I don't want to say that to make you feel, oh my gosh, like I feel like I have to go through all of these hills and mountains and everything just to get an answer to this. But I really think that, whatever guilt that you may feel, I think that's okay to feel guilty. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think that it's best for us actually to befriend these very uncomfortable emotions like guilt or shame. That's definitely what I had to learn to do in order to better manage it and really feel how it feels, not just push it away and really think about what is best for you. I think we really have the power to give ourselves the best answer, even even outside, of all the self-help books and what other people tell us, even what I'm telling you right now. I really do think, Heather, that you have the capacity to answer that for yourself. But I think the or at least your first question, feeling guilt. Um, but I think it's best to befriend that and really sit with it and um, think more, be curious about it. I think curiosity, it really helps us in language learning, and I think it helps us too with these really big questions. What does that mean for me? Have I ever felt that way before? Do I see any connection with how I may have answered this question in the past or way in the past or when I just started my journey? So kind of just start from there and think about how maybe you would have answered that question just throughout your life and then start from there, just to have a starting point. But you definitely are not alone in that feeling. Um, okay, but thank you for such a great question. I hope I answered it. Okay, so question 3 from Joanne. Thank you for your question. How have you worked to overcome the resistance within yourself towards the study of your heritage language? I think that when the pandemic began, and this was just kind of thrown at me, right? The pandemic was thrown at all of us. But I think for anyone who looked remotely Asian, there was a lot of, especially just within the Asian community, it didn't matter if you were an adoptee like me, it mattered that you looked Asian enough to be discriminated against or have really weird stares at you given during the pandemic time. And so for the first time, I have told you that I never felt any Asian, but we do have a really large Asian American population in the United States, which I also never felt a part of. I never labeled myself as such. But that is the very first time that I considered myself more Asian American because I knew that the world, whenever they saw me, they wouldn't care about my story, right? They wouldn't care that I was Nati and this and this. They only cared about what they saw because they were trying to protect themselves, which, I can understand, but of course it doesn't feel nice. And just to be grouped that way. But I did find a lot of harmony within those online groups, especially when we were all just locked in, and community of, when you have a community that you don't even have to really explain a lot to, you just say it and you feel so validated because they've been through the exact same thing. I guess when I went through that whole experience and started to actually talk with more Asian looking people, I was like, okay, it's not so bad to be Asian. So I think that that was what I think started the kind of being curious more about finding out more about how I really felt about adoption, and then figuring out, okay, I mean, I already know how to start learning a language. I've proved to myself I can do it multiple times. Why not use something that I love and know how to do to really process a really hard emotion, or a lot of hard emotions? So, thank you, Joanne. That was a really great question. And Alexander, did you choose Mandarin because it would allow you to connect with Chinese culture most directly? Are you curious about other Chinese languages spoken around where you were born? Um, so for that first one, did you choose Mandarin because it would allow you to connect? Yeah, so this is a good question. I see, and some people have asked this before. Um, and I know sometimes when I talk about this, I'm like, I don't know how confusing this is to people because there's just so much nuanced emotion, and sometimes I feel like even I can't process it all at once. But I think how I would answer that one, um, I would say not to directly connect with Chinese culture. I don't think so. I think um I think more of a connection to myself, let's say, a connection to myself, which I think is also the reason why I'm going into Chinese, and with the very first goal. This is the first language where I'm learning it, and I say my goal is not to become fluent. Maybe it might change. We always change our minds at some point, I think, but it's the very first time that I've been able to sit with myself and say, it is okay if I go into this language and I am not fluent. I was a very big perfectionist beforehand, which is why my goal was always fluency. But I think I've grown enough to the point to see the beauty in just exploring yourself way more through your own passion, and just processing again what I personally lost. And if that changes into the future where I am more interested in Chinese culture, then so be it. I am definitely open for that kind of change and observation, and I'm super glad to share it with you guys on YouTube. And are you curious about other Chinese languages spoken around where you were born? A little bit. I mean, I've thought about going back eventually. I mean, eventually, I say I have no idea when. I feel like I'm gonna have to muster up a lot of the courage to actually go back to China, but I have been thinking eventually of maybe even touring some of the orphanages. I know that some adoptees have enjoyed volunteering even at orphanages. Now might not be the best time due to what is all happening, but I think with that kind of thing and kind of actually hearing it and seeing it with my own ears and what kind of dialects even that exist. I mean, I hope I can call them dialects. I'm not I'm not sure. I'm referring when I say dialects, I am thinking about how I would probably refer to different variations of Arabic, just dialects that really exist around different populations. So it's possible, but usually when I learn a language, I'm interested in learning the main language. For example, I would be interested in learning Italian first, and then if I spent more time in the country, then maybe something Sicilian or something like that. Um, More of the languages and dialects that would be surrounding that main language, where there's a lot of resources for. So maybe in the future, but not right now. Mandarin is enough for right now. And so, question from Alexander again. Have you found yourself interested in the heritage languages of the family who adopted and raised you? Well, you know what? Whenever I talk about, or whenever I hear from my adopted family, oh, this is where we come from. Maybe we were Irish or Welsh. I think that's what my mom asked me. That is where I feel most disconnected from my family because we just don't share the same blood. And it feels like I'm talking to a stranger even at that point. And I've never really been interested in going further about knowing about family who lived before my grandfather, for example. Like I physically met my grandfather, and he therefore feels a part of me, and part of my family that I can see and that um, that he used to read to me and everything like that. So if they're in my physical memory, then I feel that they're part of my family. But before that, I really don't. So I think that's why I would not have interest in the heritage languages of the family who adopted me. But that's a really great question. And so thank you for those three. Those were really good. Question from Anna. Okay, so how might one deal with alienation and emotionalization with your heritage language from a very young age due to how people define what language should mean to you from a very young age? Yeah, that's a really hard question too. I think especially because I think from a very young age we're all just so all over the place, and we're still very even more impressionable. I definitely was super impressionable, and I'm kinda glad that I didn't confront myself at such a young age with all of these big questions, because I really don't think that would have been good for me. But sometimes, unfortunately, some people live where they live, and people are just gonna throw things at you anyway, no matter, how old or how young you are, unfortunately. So I think that in that sort of case, I would think really about searching for safety and support, whether that be from a friend or from your family, or if you don't feel safe with your family for any reason, I would go, or if you can't even afford, for example, not medical, a professional for therapy, anything like that, um, I would really suggest finding a community if that's even near you, or if it's an online community that can really help you, even just feel validated in what you feel is a really nuanced topic, and what you might feel like, oh, other people are just going to invalidate me all over again. Um, then I think finding a community is the strongest thing that you can do. It does take a while to search for such a community, and you're going to have to experiment. Don't expect it to always be a fast fix, in a sense. But at least starting with some sort of, as I said, common humanity, which is, I think, and I still believe, one of the most healing things that we can do for ourselves. And I meant it in the context in which. Ah, I see. Oh, that's interesting. So Anna added to that question, I mean it in the context in which you already speak your heritage language, but people police what it should mean to you. Oh, that's really interesting. And this is what I'm kind of scared about going into Chinese, and say that if I got to the point where I was conversational or even fluent, that people, I think especially Asian looking people who feel like they want to guilt me into what that means to me. Um, Man, so I'm going to answer it from that sort of that perspective. I think if I could, I would probably take a break from it. Sometimes I think a break is what we all need at some point. That depends though, because you might be surrounded by family at home or friends who are just used to talking to you in that language. But in that sense, I think, you really need to, again, seek support. Um, And again, if you feel like you want to, because I feel like it's hard to sometimes find those people who have such a nuanced situation, because this is not talked about at all. So even if you feel like coming to me, for example, um, to even just talk about it and process it, because sometimes you just need a person who will listen, then I think that um, that's one of the healthiest first steps you could do. Again, finding that common humanity. So don't be afraid to reach out. But thank you so much for your question. We only have a little bit a little bit left of time, so I'm going to move on. I observed many native Russian speakers feeling guilty and afraid of speaking their language after the war in Europe started. Would you have some recommendation for them if they are not ready for therapy? Oh, that's interesting. Um, Many native speakers feeling guilty and afraid of speaking their language. Yeah, and being afraid also of what other people might think of you depending on how they view the situation, right? Well, I say to you right now, I know that people are not their governments, right? And that is why I love learning sort of very different languages that are, especially in US media, really prejudiced in a lot of ways, because I know that there's so much of people to so much nuance in personality and just the values of different people that are there to discover. Um, so, if anything, I think that's what I would say to them. Um, for that, I'm going to look at this last question. Let's see. Only have 2 minutes left. There is a huge discussion about the colonial heritage and function of languages like English as a tool to impose some agendas in the recent or far past. How do you see it from your own experience? Yeah. Um, about the colonial heritage and function of languages like English. Yeah. And I guess English definitely, and I've also seen this just with the main, like, European languages that I have been drawn to from the beginning, in terms of colonialization. And I remember there was someone that had been talking about, and this was, like, in a whole Twitter, sort of feed, but they were talking about, "Oh, like, I feel bad um for Africa, for example, because they are losing like French is losing influence in Africa, like those kinds of things. And yeah, it's really tragic. And I I feel a lot of pain for those kinds of things that people must have to go through because languages are just they can be great for all of us, but I think in a sense, like for us language learners, they are privileged because they can also be used as a tool to take over a people and really oppress them in a way and take something really important away from them. So that's what that's what I would say to that. But I've for me, I don't think I've experienced it directly. If anything, because of my adoption and because I was just raised this way, English has just been the language that I've grown up in and still the most comfortable in. Um, which language? Okay, perfect. So Will asked, I think this will be our last question for today. You guys are awesome. You have had so many great questions. Okay, so Will asked, one of my heritage languages is Irish, which is a language which has been suppressed and tends to discourage people like me from learning it. Do you have any comments? Hmm, which is a language that has been suppressed. Mm. So so I'm going to take what we have here because I'm not going to pretend that I know all of the intricacies involved in, what suppression has meant for the Irish language. But I think that's a really interesting topic and tends to discourage people like me from learning it. So does that mean that you still want to learn it even though others are discouraging you? Because if that's the case, I would do what you know is best for you. As I said before, you know what's the best decision for you to take in that situation. I would just do it anyways. And I mean, this is coming from me where I've had to do a lot of processing to even come to this conclusion of wanting to learn a language like Chinese, which has a lot of meaning for me. But I think you should go for it if you despite what history has been there, if you can find resources, then I think that it would be a very interesting experience for you. And I think it's a great experience that we can have through languages. Just really as I said before, coming back to ourselves. If you think that this is going to help you discover more of yourself in the process, even if that really involves a lot of uncomfortable emotions, then I definitely encourage you to do that if you feel that it is in line with your values and if with your authenticity. I really do. But if you don't, then I don't think that you should feel guilty because again, if that suppression is there, um, that can cause a lot of negative feelings. So there's really no right or wrong answer. I want you to do what's best for you. But it looks like we are all out of time. So thank you so much, you guys, for coming. Definitely keep up with me on social media, any of my socials and YouTube channel. I would love to talk with you guys again. Thank you so much for the amazing questions, and I'm going to let you go. But thank you so much, and hopefully we'll see each other soon.